Hi everyone, and happy World Book Day. Welcome to my Share a Story. I'm going to read to you in a second, but first I want to introduce somebody very special who's going to be joining us. This is Charlie. Charlie is my bear. Charlie loves stories. So, the book that I'm going to read to you from today is part of a series. There are 3 of these books. So if you like the sound of the first chapter, which I'm going to read to you in a moment, you might be tempted to read the other books too. And this book is called Goblins. And it's a book by a writer called Philip Reeve. He's a really famous children's author and has won all sorts of prizes and medals for his children's books. And this is the first in his series of 3, all about the goblins who live at a place called Clovenstone Keep. Chapter 1 is called The Dark Tower, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. In the lands of the West, where men are few and some of the old magic lingers still, there stands the ancient fortress of Clovenstone. A wide wall rings it, tumbled now and overgrown with weeds. The trees and waters of the wild have crept inside and made their home again among its steep, deserted streets and crumbling buildings. At its heart, a crag rises, Meneth Esken, most westerly of the Bone Hill Mountains, and on the summit stands a black keep, tall as the sky, with sheer walls and horns of stone. Around this dark tower, like a stone crown on the crag's brow, there runs a lofty inner wall, guarded by 7 lesser towers. All are in ruins now, the men who raised them long since gone. Crows caw about their sagging roofs, and gargoyles lurk in their ivy like lice in beggars' beards. The highest of these 7 towers is called the Black Spike. Although it is dwarfed by the great mass of the keep behind it, it is still taller than any tower in the lands of men. From its snow-flecked battlements to the ground at the crag's foot is a very long drop indeed. And that was bad news for Scarpa, because he had just been catapulted off the top of it. Ah! He screamed, rising up, pausing a moment, flailing for handholds on the empty air, and then beginning his long fall. Ah! But after the first 1,000 feet or so, he realized that he was just going, ah! From force of habit. So he stopped. And from then on, the only sounds were the whooshing of the cold air past his ears and the occasional cottony rustle as a cloud shot by. Of course, it's not so much the falling that bothers me, thought Scarpa, as the ivied stones and mean little windows of the Black Spike rushed past him. It's the hitting the ground that's the trouble. Below him, now that he'd got used to the feeling that the wind was pushing its thumbs into his eyes, he could see plump white clouds dotting the middle air like sheep. Below them, the bleak buttresses of Meneth Esken spread out like the fingers of a splayed stone hand, with ruined buildings clustering between them. Weeds and little trees had rooted themselves in the rotting roofs and between the flagstones of the silent streets, and as the land sloped downwards towards the outer wall 5 miles away, the trees grew thicker and thicker, forming a dense wood, from whose canopy old bastions and outbuildings poked up like lonely islands. This was Scarpa's world, and as he looked down upon it, he was interested to notice several details that Stenorian's map of old Clovenstone had got wrong, but not that interested, because the details were rushing towards him at great speed, and long before he could tell any one of his discoveries, he was going to be splattered all over them like a careless delivery of raspberry jam. Indeed, it was maps and books and things of that sort that were to blame for Scarpa being in this sticky situation in the first place. He felt quite bitter when he thought about it and glared fiercely at a passing crow. Scarpa was a goblin, as the crow guessed at once from his amber eyes, clawed paws, long flapping ears, and the tail that snapped behind him like a whip as he fell. There were goblins in all the 7 towers of Clovenstone. They were born of the stone of the mountains, and they had a fierce greed for gold and silver and other shining things, which they spent most of their time searching for in the ancient armories and storerooms, or stealing from each other and from the goblins of the other towers. There had been a time when all goblins had been servants of the same great sorcerer, the Like Lord, who had raised Clovenstone and ruled the whole world from his stone throne high in the keep. But years without number had passed since the Like Lord's army was defeated at the Battle of Dor Coth by the armies of the kings of men. And for as long as any living goblin could recall, each of the 7 towers had been home to a separate goblin gang. Sometimes the gangs from 2 or 3 different towers would form an alliance and go roaring out of Clovenstone to raid the fisherfolk and miners of the little man kingdoms on the nibbled coast. But they were untrusting, untrustworthy creatures, and their alliances didn't last. It was never long before they were fighting each other over the loot, safe in their home towers again, with the entrances blocked up by barricades of rubble and old furniture. Black Spike Tower, where Scarpa lived, or had lived until he was catapulted off its roof that morning, was ruled by a large and dangerous goblin named King Nobbler, and the goblins who lived in it were called the Black Spike Boys. There was no crueler raiders, greedier hoarders, or more ruthless robbers anywhere in Clovenstone. Fighting and loot was what they lived for. Fighting and loot and eating. Fighting and loot and eating, and then more fighting. Except for Scarpa. Scarpa was different. Old Breslaw had seen it as soon as Scarpa hatched. Breslaw was different too. He had lost an eye, an ear, a leg, and most of his tail in a raid on the nibbled coast 40 years before. He was only half the goblin he used to be, and since he could no longer go out raiding with the rest of the tribe, King Nobbler had made him hatchling master. Once a year, on the night when the horns of the new moon seemed to rest on the summit of the keep, Breslaw would descend into the Black Spike's deep cellars, unlock a heavy cobweb-covered door, and steer his squeaking wheelbarrow down deep and lonely tunnels, which plunged beneath the roots of Clovenstone into the dark under the mountains, where lay the lava lake. There, in the cauldrons of the earth, the restless, silvery hot magma roiled and churned. The lake spat out little gobs of lava, which hardened shiny black upon the walls and floors of its great cave. Once a year, it spat out something else as well, egg stones. Patiently, using a long-handled shovel and wrapped in wet skins to save himself from being shriveled by the heat, old Breslaw would hobble back and forth along the hot shores collecting the egg stones. Sometimes, through the fumes that hung above the lake, he could see the hatchling masters from other towers patrolling their own stretches of shoreline, but he did not interfere with them or try to stop them gathering up their own egg stones. Each to his beach. That was one of the few scraps of the old law which all Clovenstone's goblins still obeyed. Nor did he try to peer up the great chimney holes, which opened above the lake and were supposed to reach right up inside the keep. When Breslaw was a younger goblin, the idea of getting inside the keep had kept him awake at night, but he'd long since come to accept that there was no way in. Mad Mannikin's lads from Slate Top Tower had tried it once, creeping out over the lake on scaffolding made from old floorboards. The scaffolding had fallen apart and dropped into the lava before the goblins climbing it got anywhere near those black openings. So Breslaw just kept his eye on the basalt beach and scooped up the dully glowing egg stones as they landed. And when they were all safely in his barrow, he trundled them back up the steep miles to his chamber high in Black Spike Tower, which was called the hatchery. There he kept them warm beside his fire until they began to jiggle and to crack. The goblins who had hatched from the same batch of egg stones as Scarpa did not look alike. Earthborn creatures do not resemble each other in the way that members of a human family or a human race do. The sizes and shapes of Scarpa and his batch brothers had been decided by some strange whim of the earth itself. Some had scales and some had fur, some had squashed-in snouts like pigs, others long pointed noses and trailing ears. Most had fangs and claws and beady black eyes in which a little gleam of vicious glee appeared when they kicked aside the fragments of their egg stones and saw the mini mallets and little training cudgels which Breslaw left leaning against the hatchery walls. With scratchy cries, they snatched the tiny weapons up and began belting each other over the head. Breslaw watched them and nodded in satisfaction. More good, brutish, black spike boys who would be a credit to the tribe of King Nobbler. Then he spotted Scarpa. He was smaller than the other hatchlings, with long ears, a mat of reddish hair, a ginger tuft at the end of his tail, and an odd light in his yellow eyes. Breslaw saw the way he hung back unnoticed in the corners of the cavern, as if he thought it might not be such a good idea to let other goblins swing huge lumps of timber at his newly hatched skull. Breslaw rummaged through the heap of eggstone shards and picked up the still warm fragments of the stone which Scarpa had emerged from. Sure enough, thick veins of slow silver ran this way and that across its surface. Slow silver, the strangest and most magical of all metals. It shone like real silver, but you could knead it like putty, and when exposed to certain types of flame, it would burn with a strange fire. In olden times, great sorcerers like the Light Lord had used it in their spells. These days it did not seem much use for anything, but it was rare and valuable and shiny, and goblins loved rare, valuable, shiny things. Breslaw stuffed Scarpa's egg shards away inside his clothes before the hatchlings saw them. Later he would prize out the slow silver and add it to the little ball of the stuff he kept in a secret place in one of his hiding holes in the walls of the hatchery. It was years since he'd found an eggstone with that much slow silver in it. From such a stone, long years before, Breslaw had hatched, and now he saw in young Scarpa another like himself, a goblin wiser and more cunning than the rest. I must keep an eye on this youngling, he told himself. Sure enough, Scarpa learned to talk much more quickly than his batch brothers, whom Breslaw had named Yabber, Gutgust, Bootle, Wrench, and Libnog. He was the only one who paid attention when Breslaw tried to teach them the goblin lore, and while the others fought over food at mealtimes in the big busy chamber called the Scoffery, Scarpa always found some way to spirit hunks of meat and cave mold cheese out from under their squabbling snouts and carry it away through Black Spike's maze of passages and wobbly wooden ladders to some dark little disused room where he could eat alone, undisturbed and unobserved, except by Breslaw, whose beady eye was always on him. Breslaw watched the clever way young Scarpa sneaked little shining trinkets from the other goblins and hid them away in his own secret places, where he could fetch them out and gloat over them when he thought no one was watching. He reminds me of me when I was new, the cunning old hatchling master chuckled. One day, when a storm was racketing its way through the Bone Hills and the rest of the tribe were all outside on the battlements, netting crows or hurling boulders and rude words at mad mannikins lads, Breslaw found young Scarpa lounging in the Scoffery. He was sitting in King Nobbler's own chair and nibbling leftovers from King Nobbler's own dinner. "What are you doing here?" the hatchling master demanded. "You should be out with the others. Boulders don't throw themselves, you know." Scarpa shrugged and popped a plump cave spider into his mouth. "It's raining up, down and sideways out there," he said. "Hailing too. It's warmer and drier in here, and while those idiots are busy, I can get close to the fire and eat." Breslaw drew himself to his full height. He stood about 5'6", which was tall for a goblin, and his eyes glittered. No hatchling had spoken to a hatchling master like that since, well, he thought, not since he had spoken like it to his hatchling master, old Wheezing Bottom, more years ago than he cared to recall. So instead of screeching at the impudent young sprout and giving him a clout with his teaching mallet, he said, "Come with me, young Scarpa," and led him down the Black Spike's winding, wormy staircases to a half-forgotten chamber near the tower's foot. Thick skeins of cobweb stretched and tore as Breslaw heaved the door open. "Behold," he said, "the bum-wipe heaps." Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to my story from Goblins today by Philip Reed. If you did, then maybe think about finishing the story and finding out what happens to Scarpa and the rest of the goblins. Have a fantastic World Book Day, and I will see you back in school. Bye.